I want to go over what to what extent means, looking at the sheet now, which is the definitions for key verbs from the Social Studies 11 ministry document. It says here, under to what extent, advance arguments in favor of a position or point of view and respond to or take into account arguments opposed to that position or point of view. So when you see a to what extent in your essay question, you'll need to advance arguments in favor of a position or point of view, and then take into account arguments opposed to that position or point of view. I'd like to do a sample now. So in short, when you see to what extent, you need to consider both sides. Consider both sides of the question. You don't need to argue both sides. You don't have to agree with both sides. You just have to consider both sides. Here's the sample question that I'd like to go through. To what extent was Canada successful militarily in World War I? So here's your essay question. What should you do? The first thing you need to do is you need to know what to what extent means. And from what we just went through, you have to consider both sides of this question here. The second part is then understand and know what those two sides actually are. So you have here, to what extent was Canada successful militarily in World War I? You can sort of deduce that those two sides are, one of them is Canada was successful militarily in World War I. The other side is Canada was not successful militarily in World War I. And then from there, I wrote, remember, you can argue either side. You don't have to argue the positive side. You can also argue the negative side. So remember that. From here, what I would do is I would then plan. Take note, too, in terms of the question, how it's confined. It confines itself in terms of its military, and also confines itself within a historical time period, which is World War I. So in this case, stuff like on the domestic front really wouldn't count, or you would have to tie it somehow to the military. Okay. What you should mostly be thinking here is specific to this question is are the battles. So what I'd like to do now is go through some of the battles and classify them, because that will make up sort of the bulk of the evidence. Was Canada successful or not? The first major battle that Canada was involved in was Ypres. And I think you can put Ypres under both, but I think it really leans under successful, right? In terms of Ypres, Canadians were charged with defending an area, and they did so. So Canadians successfully defended the area. And I'm writing this here too because it adds, so what makes Ypres successful? This is a little bit of explanation down here. The next major battle that Canadians were fought in was the Somme offensive. And I think the Somme would really sort of fall under not successful. Why? In short, objectives were not met. And just to sort of further explain that, they didn't really achieve that much ground. And they suffered huge casualties. Massive casualties. The next major battle would be Vimy Ridge. And I think Vimy Ridge sort of clearly goes under successful militarily. I mean, they took the ridge. They did what they were supposed to, and they achieved it. Next major battle would be Passchendaele. Passchendaele is an interesting one. I think you can put Passchendaele under both columns. And remember, it is about how you define it. If you define militarily in terms of, and the battles in terms of achieving objectives, Passchendaele was a success. They took the town. But I think you can also define success in terms of importance and casualty rate. And in this case, it would not be considered a success. First of all, they suffered massive casualties. And the objective was of little importance. The last one, the last major battle that occurs is the 100 Days Offensive. And I would sort of clearly put this under successful militarily. They pushed the Germans back. Pushed the Germans back at the end of the war. Now you've sort of classified the information that you remember. Now what are you going to argue? What's your thesis going to look like? I would lean towards arguing, in this case, Canada was successful militarily in World War I. And then I would go with the 2-1 scenario. Because you're going to argue success, I would look at, or I would try to find your 2 strongest points. I think the 2 strongest points here are Vimy Ridge and the 100 Days Offensive. But then you also have to consider the other side. So one paragraph will have to be about the other side here. And I think that sort of con argument will be the Somme. With looking at all of this, Vimy Ridge and the 100 Days Offensive and the Somme, my thesis would be something like this. Despite the massive casualties during the Somme offensive, Canada was successful militarily in World War I, as demonstrated by the Battle of Vimy Ridge and the final 100 Days Offensive. Okay.